Okay, hello. Welcome everyone to the third in our series considering Troy in the 21st century at the Ure Museum. I'm not in the Ure Museum, I'm in a funny background. That's Lowbury Hill in Oxfordshire, which is relevant to the Ure Museum. More on that some other time. But for the meantime, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Emma Aston, to introduce today's speaker. Just so you don't have too much of me, and then you'll get to hear from me again in the Q&A for this event. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll have, this time I put on the proper Q&A, so we should be able to have Q&A at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Amy, and warmest greetings to everybody present and also our online audience. So it feels peculiar in a way introducing Dr. Dunstan Lowe because we still think of him as a Reading person. Really, he worked here for quite a long time when I first arrived here, and we miss him as a colleague. But our loss is Kent's gain. He's the senior lecturer in Latin literature at the University of Kent. And summarising his career and his research profile is rendered the more challenging by the amazing combination of sort of detailed literary analysis and an appreciation of the role of classics in contemporary popular culture. So, for example, his 2015 book, Monsters and Monstrosity in Augustan Poetry, reflects a long-standing and continuing interest in particularly Virgil and Ovid, but absolutely not limited to those authors. In fact, if you look at the articles he's been publishing lately, you find an amazing range of topics and texts, and a couple of recent things that caught my eye concerned monumental weather vanes in classical antiquity as an overlooked architectural form, and suspending disbelief magnetic levitation in antiquity and the Middle Ages. Particularly, I think about levitating objects rather than levitating people, Dunstan, but perhaps it crosses the line between the two. An amazing chronological range there. Regarding popular culture, in 2009, Dunstan published a book co-edited with Kim Shahabuddin, also here at Reading, Classics for All, Reworking Antiquity in Mass Cultural Media, and the process of doing modern reception really well and rigorously and achieving that symbiosis between antiquity and the present day and getting classics beyond its traditional audiences is a really crucial part of what he's achieved. Today we're going to hear from Dunstan on the theme of Write a New History, the Trojan War in the Digital Age, and so without further ado I have great pleasure in handing over to Dr. Dunstan Lowe.
Well, thank you, Emma, you made me sound amazing. I'm going to well, I can't fail to disappoint now, but I will have lots of pretty pictures. So in a moment, I'm going to share my screen, and the first thing you'll see, hopefully, is going to be some very literal, superficial glitz. So let me just get my first slide going here. Okay, so, and I'm going to begin by talking about Trojan receptions in general, and I'm sure that you've heard a fair bit about those already from this seminar series. Right, can I just make sure that this is actually right? Are you seeing something vaguely sparkly now? I assume you are. I'm going to carry on talking unless I'm interrupted. Okay, so Trojan myth is well, it's right at the heart of Hellenic culture. I mean, it's near the center of gravity for Greek culture, and then if you then look at post-Greek European cultures, they continue to be really interested in Troy, and not only Homer's two epics, which were jointly the foundation of Greek literature, but also Rome's greatest epic, the Aeneid. That's Troy fan fiction. Basically, all of the big epics are Trojan, and or biggest ones. And then in the Middle Ages, a big chunk of the matter of Rome, which is one of the three major story cycles of medieval romance, alongside the matter of Britain and the matter of France, is all about Troy. And I think what we're left with now is what we might call the Troy mythos, the Troy story world, and it's a very rich one, and we find it in basically all modern media, and of course digital games are no exception. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. But I'm also going to dip into probably the biggest profile popular media portrayal of Troy in the 21st century, and that was the the movie in 2004, Wolfgang Petersen's Troy, and I'm going to refer back to that later. But for now, I'm going to give you a little bit of an outline of what I will say. I'm laying down 3 ground rules for how Troy is portrayed in video games. The first rule is that we already know the ending, so there's no spoilers. The second is that the wooden horse has to be there somehow, regardless of when or where you are telling the story. And then thirdly, the Trojans, whenever they're portrayed as a community or a people or a civilization, are warriors. And we don't think of Greeks homogeneously, the Greeks collectively, as warrior-like until the 21st century, because it was always Rome that was the militaristic society. That was the preconception about Rome, that they were the guys with the spears, and the Spartans were kind of honorary Romans as well. Things have shifted a little bit now, but when you say Athenian, people don't immediately think warrior. They still tend to think of all the other achievements of Athens in the classical period. So when you put the word Trojan forth, especially in North America, it conjures up images of virility, aggressiveness, maybe a kind of a stalwart type of butchness, because they are the defenders in the siege. But by and large, yeah, they're warriors. So those are the 3 things that I'm going to talk about. And I'll take each one of those in turn and use that as an excuse to survey a large number of different games. I couldn't possibly cover all of the games that portray ancient Troy and Trojan myth. There's a lot of them, but I will try to stuff this presentation with lots of them. And I'm very happy to discuss any examples that I haven't mentioned in the Q&A afterwards. Okay, I'm going to move on then. So the first thing is we already know the ending. Homer tells us what the ending of the story is. The Iliad only covers a period of, well, it says 9 days, but it's more like 50 days if you add everything in, near the end of a 10-year war. And it's shortly before the end, but we don't see the fall of Troy in the Iliad. We get the aftermath of it in the Odyssey, but the actual fall is not narrated in the 2 Homeric epics. However, he doesn't attempt to keep it a secret as to what's going to happen. For example, there's an omen at one point that tells us that Troy will fall. Yeah, so in Iliad 15, Zeus explicitly says Troy is going to fall, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, yeah, that's an ingredient of the Trojan story, that you know it's a siege, and you know that they're going to, not only that it will end, but exactly the sequence of events that will happen at the end. The horse and even the deaths of individual heroes are organized very nicely in a narrative. Okay, so if we go on from the idea that it's not about what's going to happen, but how it's going to happen, very much like the experience of watching a tragedy. We don't go to a tragedy hoping that things are going to be a happy ending. It's about the experience of reaching that point, seeing exactly what path is taken and experiencing different aspects of it. So if we see a narrative in that form, then we don't have to have a surprise ending or a mystery. A suspension of disbelief is all we need. Okay, if I go on to a couple of examples of games now, I'm going to begin with the genre of strategy. So unsurprisingly, with a series of battles, in all the different game styles, there's been quite a good representation of Troy in strategy games. And if let's see, this is going to be a little bit about Battle for Troy from 2004. And remember that day, 2004. You'll see in the background, one of the first things you have to do in the game is to rescue Achilles. And it's a combination of Homeric content, a prophecy of Helenus, the priest, a canonical figure, speaking role in the Iliad in Book 3. But it's combined with an incident that hasn't really got a precedent. A small band of Trojan soldiers is captured Achilles, and your first task is to defeat a small band of soldiers, and that's your starting mission. So some liberties have been taken, but there's lots of recognizable content here. And if I go on to the next slide, you'll see that the Battle for Troy is marketed to people who know the story. This is the front and back of the box. The front shows a horse and two opposing sides, and this game allows you to pursue the Trojan campaign or the Greek campaign. And I'm just going to read the blurb at the back in case it's too small. It says, Paris, king of Troy, has stolen the heart and soul of Helen, queen of Sparta. Feel the wrath and fury of a king betrayed as Menelaus rages to return his queen. Now 2 great legions stand poised on the brink of war. Never mind about the word legions, just keep moving. May the gods be with you as you choose sides in an alliance that will soon drown the city of Troy in a sea of blood, all for the love of a woman. And Helen there on the side is perhaps the second most iconic thing about the Trojan myth cycle after the horse. And this is the only Helen that you're going to see. There are lots and lots of horses all over this presentation. So if you really like the Trojan horse, you're in for a treat. In fact, that's going to be my second of 3 topics for discussion. But let me just wrap up about the idea of the preordained ending of the city of Troy in games. This is Gates of Troy. It came out as an expansion for the game Spartan, but it's a standalone product, so kind of a sequel. Anyway, it came out in 2004, and in Gates of Troy, the back of the box makes equally dramatic claims about your power to control this this world and its story. And there's a bit more emphasis on combat here, but you can see a bit of the back here. I apologise for the very bad photo. I took this in my office yesterday. So it says here and there, take control of one of the 19 new heroes, Odysseus, Paris, Hector, or even Achilles. Use them tactically. Something about morale, it's about moral there. And cut a sway through your enemies. And then down at the bottom, this is where I got my title from for the presentation. Build great cities and structures like the Trojan horse, and through leadership, diplomacy, espionage, and the might of your army, write a new history for Greece. Write a new history. Well, you're going to get the same story, but it's possible on the micro scale to have things play out differently. And of course, there has to be something at stake for it to be a game, for it to be an interactive experience. I just want to draw your attention to the front of the box. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that we're looking at a generic hero in a very recognizable style of helmet. This is the kind of thing you see in cinema a lot. And I just want you to notice, first of all, that there's a horsey in the background. Secondly, that you have a color scheme, which is muted bronzes, golds, and browns. And thirdly, that there is a sort of word salad in the background. Evocative words such as Sparta, Agamemnon, Helen, and so on can be picked out. I'm not sure if you can see that very clearly, but hopefully you can see the word Helen underneath the horse. This is the look of the front of the box. And I'm going to come back to this later, but I will just say for now, it's a very 2004 mood, that visual style. So let's keep moving. It's time to talk about the horse. This is not the same type of game at all. I could talk about any number of games if I'm going to focus on the horse, but I'm going to pick one that is lesser known. This is an obscurity. It's a cancelled game. It's never saw the light of day, but a prototype is available, and people have tinkered around with it and found the assets inside it. As you feast your eyes on this, let me just say a few things about why I want to focus on this game, the one that never even was made. It's a Super Mario tie-in from the era when the Mario license was being traded all over, and people were making really quite poor games with the Mario brand on a number of different platforms. And the Philips CDI, a CD-based console, was, well, some developers were looking to have their own Mario game for this platform, and they got as far as throwing together some playable sections of a proposed game. They showed it to Nintendo, and Nintendo said it's very nice for 3 weeks or so, but it's not really good enough, so sorry, we're not going to sell you the license. And so it was never made. But what we're looking at here is an example of how to map the true power of a cultural theme, anything, a character, a story, a representation of those things. You know, so for a given movie or whatever, maybe even a book or basically any kind of cultural phenomenon, to truly map its effect on the popular consciousness. You don't just look at the thing itself. You have to look at the penumbra, the shape around it. So not just the peak, but the shadow, the splash, the crater, the stuff around it. And when I say that, I'm thinking about knockoffs, imitations, borrowings, allusions, the kind of thing where, especially in a very fast-moving medium, one with lots and lots of competitive products trying to catch the consumer's attention, you often get the same kind of image or theme or motif or, as I said, color scheme appearing in a number of different places, and that really maps out the importance of that original influence. Okay, in this game prototype you've got a Trojan horse, and it's actually, if you can see in the middle, there's a list of the areas that they propose to include, and we're interested in ancient, and they had ancient Greek 1, 2, 3. Area 1 is on the left, that's the exterior of the horse. Area 2 is the interior of the horse, and you can just make out a Cooper trooper there, a turtle enemy wearing a centurion's helmet inside the horse. And then there was number 3 as well, which was basically kind of wibbly wobbly underwater area with large bits of Greek masonry and columns. And if you ask me, that's absolutely supposed to be Atlantis, or would have been. So Troy and Atlantis are the things that a person in a hurry doing a rush job in 1993 is where their mind goes first when they think of ancient Greek culture, in particular Greek myth. And 2 out of 3 is the horse. So yes, that Trojan horse is extremely important. It crops up in games where it's unrelated to any kind of historical setting, but I'll spare you the trivia. I want to go back to the movies now. The horse in the movie, Troy, is on the left, and it's quite striking looking. It's clearly made out of bits of ship, as in the original story, and the kind of mess of images on the right are all from different games. The top left is Warriors Legends of Troy. The top right is Assassin's Creed Odyssey. The bottom left is from it's actually a multiplayer map in God of War Ascension from 2013, and then the bottom right is a PC game called Loki, and it has a Troy in it. And the picture looks very strange because you have to, when you go behind objects, they become transparent. So what I had to do was pull the camera way up to see the top of the horse, and so you can see you're playing a character who's visible through it, but the outline is clear enough to show that it's very obviously the same kind of horse as in the movie Troy. And that was 2007. The bottom left is 2013, top left 2011, top right 2018. And yeah, I think basically the horse is now almost officially the Peterson movie horse in most representations. If you look at the ones from before, for example, the Mario one, they're very different. They tend to be proper wood-coloured ones. These others are they're generally dark. Let's see, what do they tend to have? That kind of Stegosaurus mane, the downward pointing head, maybe lots of ropes all over it. Yeah, so 3 or 4 of those 5 things, and it's pretty clear where the influence comes from. I haven't talked about Achilles in this presentation. I'm going to talk about a person named Achilles in a minute. But the Achilles from the movie is also highly influential. And when you say Achilles, most people will now give you a person with long blonde hair because of Brad Pitt. If you haven't seen this movie, by the way, and I keep going on about it, you can get the flavour of it with a few screenshots. But it does reward your attention, especially if you know Homer and you want to nitpick. The very distinctive change that it made was to give the gods a bit of a rest. The gods are an important part of the list of characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they've been kind of retired from the movie Troy. That in itself is influential, and I'm going to come back to that later, but I want to get more games in here. So let's see, that was the horse then. You have to have a wooden horse, and you have to have the ending that Troy loses. And the third of my 3 ground rules was that the Trojans are tough. The Trojans are warriors. And that takes us to another perhaps obscure game. This is from 1986, a game called Trojan. That was the Western name. The original Japanese title was Tatakai no Banka, which means Requiem for a Battle. But so you might think, oh, this is a bit of Western tweaking, a little bit of Western rebranding, so that people would think, oh, Trojan, okay, that sounds grand. Actually, despite the Mad Max influenced futuristic setting, the gameplay is actually it's not without classical allusions, and in fact the character is called Trojan in game, so he is called Trojan. In fact, if you look at the image on the right of your screen, there's an enemy called Trojan, and that's your evil mirror. You have to fight yourself, so you have to fight evil Trojan, but you are good Trojan. And in the bottom right of that screen, you can see the name Achilles. And Achilles is the ultimate enemy of the game. He's being faced up against in the middle picture. So we've got Trojan versus Achilles. Weirdly, the whole thing is set in the future. And if it had a prequel, if it had an inspiration, then it would be the lead designer's earlier success, Kung Fu Master from 1984. So that was a Kung Fu game. And this is similar in style, but with a different setting. So not really classical in its background, and apparently there's some kind of a plot about demonic spirits of past warriors possessing people in the future. So civilization collapses, warlords arise. It's very like Mad Max, except demonic powers from the past warriors, latch onto people and control them. And I assume that all of the bosses on the right hand side are supposed to be controlled by past characters. Yeah, none of that plot is indicated in the game. This is all marketing surrounding the game, but it is true that we see 2 heroic forces opposed, and we've got the good guy called Trojan, and we've got the bad guy called Achilles. I will only say that it's a bit odd to have Achilles as the bad guy. He's usually supposed to be the one we focalize through when we look at the Trojan story, especially the Iliad. But why not? And in fact, I want to go back to the idea of strategy games giving you both sides, 2 different campaigns, a Greek campaign and a Trojan campaign, and reflect on that, the fact that this is in fact very authentically Homeric, because Homer avoids having a black and white view. We don't have a good and evil showdown. There's none of that kind of Star Wars mentality, and that's partly why it's been so inspiring and so adaptable and so expandable, because you care about both sides, and you see both sides. The avoidance of black and white good and evil in Homer might therefore have made the Trojan cycle appealing in strategy games, and in fact in other games too. I mentioned Warriors Legends of Troy. I'll come back over to that in just a moment, but that game also gives you the chance to play from the Greek and from the Trojan point of view, 2 different campaigns. Yeah, the games that do choose sides tend to have bigger fantasy villains in hand. They care about something else. So in this case, warlords in the future, like in Mad Max. We don't need to see them as good guys. But it's a totally different outlook from the more detailed engagements with the Trojan myth, apart from just a couple names. Right, so I just mentioned Warriors Legends of Troy. This game from 2011 is notable as a kind of offshoot of the Dynasty Warriors franchise, a very well established, a very popular series of games, which is based ultimately on the Chinese Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So it's a historical battle themed franchise, and it's been through a couple of filters where it's become more of a fantasy. So there are supernatural elements in it. Warriors Legends of Troy in 2011 is kind of a Western version of that franchise, except one notable difference is it has a lot more gore, so it's quite bloody. And one other notable thing for this screenshot is that little label in the top corner, 45 Kleos. The more kills you get in a row, the more Kleos points you get. So if you're looking for the idea of Kleos in games, then this is what it turns into. That's not very Homeric, but it is interesting that they decide to use that word. So there is at least some attempt to allude back to the Greek literature, which has inspired this game. Okay. If we move forward now to a much more recent game, Total War Saga Troy. I think this is the one game that I couldn't help but mention. It's interesting to consider its the line it kind of walks between historical and literary, historical and mythological, because what we see in this game is a very Iliadic narrative set in a kind of a Bronze Age historical setting. So again, as in the movie Troy, the supernatural has been taken out. And there's even a couple of examples, outright examples of euhemerism. This word refers to Euhemerus, an ancient interpreter of myth, a Greek author. And what he did was he basically reduced all myth to misunderstandings, Chinese whispers, or the American game of telephone, where retellings have led to misunderstandings, where people believe in things like the gods being supernatural in various ways. According to Euhemerus, the gods were just people, but their fame had grown beyond the reality and become exaggerated. And so Euhemerus tried to take all of the supernatural out of myth and strip it back to what he perceived as a kind of kernel of historical truth. And that's kind of what Total War Saga Troy does. It's the saga sub-strand of the Total War franchise is more story driven, but the Total War franchise is a very long running and well established strategy, real-time strategy franchise. And so what we get is historical battles with a bit more of a focus on individual warriors. They're very important strategically, but no actual supernatural stuff. And this is a quote from the director of the game, Maya Georgieva. I hope I haven't pronounced that wrongly. And I'm going to just read it out in case you can't make it out. We of course cannot omit the Trojan horse in a total war setting, so we had to decide between the three most plausible explanations. In the end, we decided to have them all. So we have 3 Trojan horses and 3 different interpretations of the Trojan horse within the game. One of them is the classic one, which is the gift of the Greeks. You get to play this gambit with Odysseus, who basically props up a ship with a horse head. This is period appropriate, actually, she notes, full of gifts and hidden warriors. So he kind of gives a boat with a horse's head on it as a gift basket to the Greeks. And they think, oh, it's some kind of a peace offering, or I don't know, maybe it was an offering to the gods that they've left behind by mistake, and we can grab it. So it's to trick the Trojans into thinking that they've got hold of a bunch of goodies. Okay, and the other 2, by the way, one of them I think is some kind of a siege engine, and the other one is just an earthquake. There's a Trojan horse interpreted as a natural disaster, which breaches the walls and allows Troy to fall. Anyway, so they put all 3 of those in. It's a very interesting strategy. It's almost like Herodotus giving you every version of every possibility, every way of explaining the legend, and then you can choose. Okay, so from this same game, I can't help but give you this little alternative form of the Trojan horse. This is from the expansion that has just been released for Total War Saga Troy, which is called Mythos, and adds in some outright mythological things. It adds Cerberus and you can get Cyclops units. Basically, it dehistoricizes a very historicized version of of Homeric epic, although not in Homeric directions. And this just adorable kind of a seahorse type of horse is the new version that you get in that expansion. Okay, one more thing to say about the Total War version of Troy before I move on to yet another game is going to be how they portray the world map. This is rather nice. I think this is perhaps one of the best ideas in the game. This is how they handle the idea of fog of war. So in strategy games, you have an advantage when you can see areas on the map, when you've explored them, and then you can exploit them. Most of it is unknown to you, and as you progress, you kind of illuminate more areas of the map. And the bits that you don't see yet are covered in darkness or fog or whatever, and that's customarily called fog of war in strategy games. Now, the fog of war in Total War Saga Troy, it consists of papyrus. There's a great vast sheet of papyrus with Greek writing on it, and you can see some of it at the bottom of the screen, I hope. And as you progress, as you remove areas of unknown historical reality, which exist only as writing, then they smolder away, they're singed and burned, and the patch expands, and you kind of unravel that area. Basically, this image of a world made of text, I think, very nicely captures how they've used Homer and tried to tell a historical story, a historical reality, even to visualize that historical reality within the parameters of a text. So they kind of, as you progress through your landscape, you're kind of unraveling what is mere words and turning it into something concrete, as the game designers have intended. And of course, it becomes much more beautiful that way. But I do want to remind you that a bunch of words, kind of as a texture in the background, especially on this color scheme, would recall that other what was it? Gates of Troy front cover that I showed you earlier, and those all go back to the marketing for the movie Troy. So on these posters, you see they made the characters look as if they are made of bronze or even gold, kind of embossed gold, perhaps heavily photoshopped. And as you can see, in different ways, these posters use words as kind of an inscription, or kind of a somewhere in between an inscription on a metal object and an inscription on a stone monument. And they basically sprinkle the words in. And the one on the left, which is the Brad Pitt one, it has the names of key actors highlighted, and then behind it has words like kings, what else? Kings, cousin, warrior, hero, a mother, allies, legend, wives, and things like that. And on the right, I think it's the same words, legends, gods, brothers, lovers, wives, and so on. But this kind of Wordle type of presentation is to subtly imply that there's something valuable here, there's something grand, something very old, perhaps semi-visible, but extremely important, and yeah, filled with kind of vivid and evocative plot. Yeah, I'm not sure that all of that applies to the games which use this visual style, but it clearly has had some influence. And you could say that in turn, this visual rhetoric of the muted bronze and gold and so on also shows up in the way that things are portrayed in Frank Miller's 300, in the movie version. Of course, the comic book already used some things like that, with lots of splashes of red. But yeah, you might say that's a kind of a 21st century tradition within the grand historical epic set in Greece and Rome. Okay, back to my 3 ground rules. I'm going to expand them a little bit. I'm going to add one more rule, and then I'm going to mention something which is going to be my end point. So I'm working towards a conclusion here. These are my 3 ground rules. I think they've withstood examination with these various examples. So we know the ending. The horse has to be there somehow, in some form. And in the Total War version of Homer's Iliad, there are 3 different interpretations of the wooden horse, all available at once. And then finally, the Trojans are warriors, and that explains the name of the game Trojan, even though it has nothing to do with Troy. As I said, they're warriors which are basically bereft of other achievements. The one thing they do is to defend a city. The Trojans are not known for anything else, unfortunately. And it's not that they are tamers of horses or anything else that they're known for in the time of Homer, or what else is it? Having round-topped towers and all these other great things. None of that has penetrated the popular consciousness. Only the idea that they defend a city, they do it in a committed way. And possibly we like Hector as well, because he comes off very nicely in most portrayals of the narrative. Right, so it's all about Homer, and it's weird in a way to say that Homer is always so influential when the horse is the one visual object that has to be there, because the horse is not in Homer. The horse is in Virgil's Aeneid, and I'm now going to talk about my 4th rule: don't mention the Romans, because one thing that the Trojans are is early. They're Homeric. They have to be Homeric. You can't talk about post-Homeric Troys, even though there are so many. And I started by mentioning a whole list that go right down to the present day. I'm going to talk about one example of another cancelled game. I'm a little bit obsessed with cancelled games. I think they deserve more attention because they show you, in quite a graphic way, how things can go really wrong. And the game I'm going to talk about is this one, Ilios, Betrayal of Gods, which lived and died in 2016. And it struck me as really unusual because it was a story of the fall of Troy, which was explicitly Virgilian in one sense. So this character you see in the middle of the screen, being pursued by a winged beast, that's Polites. And Polites does appear in Homer, but really he's best known from the Aeneid, because Aeneas sees his horrible death. He comes in being chased by the downright nasty son of Achilles, Pyrrhus, aka what's his other name, Neoptolemus. And so he's chased in, and then he seeks supplication. He takes refuge at an altar, and you're allowed to do that. If you touch the altar, it's like in the playground. If you touch the altar, then you're safe and you can't be killed, because to do so would be to desecrate the altar. Unfortunately, the Pyrrhus that we see in Virgil doesn't care, and he's extremely nasty to Polites. He slaughters him before the eyes of his aged father, and that's a really bad thing to do. Mocks him, and then he mocks the father as he slaughters him too. And this is all before the eyes of his frightened wife and all of their frightened daughters, who are all still clinging to the altar like doves, we're told. So this horrible death of Polites is part of a kind of a little feast of cruelty, which Aeneas must watch from the rooftop, and he can't intervene in it. And what these developers, Aurora Game Studio was the name of them, intended to do was to take the character of Polites and make him the hero of his own game. The second part of the title, Betrayal of Gods, is a whole other kettle of fish. I'm very happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But basically, in video games, the gods are the enemy. That's how things work in the 21st century, and it's also true of mythological movies. But in this example, it would have been Polites for the first time ever as the hero of a game, and he is escaping through the burning rooftops of Troy. And I'm going to show you one more image from this game. This is promotional materials from back then. Polites is speaking to apparently a very evil character holding a bloodstained knife, and you see here that this is a fantasy version of the story. They described it as cyberpunk, although I would have said as steampunk, but I would have said cyberpunk. Clearly there's high-tech stuff going on here, Maybe Polites has been brought back from the dead and rebuilt as some kind of cyborg. It's not really clear. We'll never know, I guess. But Ilios' betrayal of gods would have been the story of Polites, and therefore a recognisably Aeneid-based video game narrative. And that would have been probably the first one. But there's a bit of a curse around the Aeneid, and it's not just that it's Roman. It might have other problems too. You probably know the 1981 movie Clash of the Titans with monster effects by Ray Harryhausen. It was a massive success. It was great. It had Laurence Olivier, it had Ursula Andress, lots of other famous actors in it. Very influential. That movie redesigned Medusa forever in popular culture, gave her a bow and a snake tail. But the other thing that it did was lay the groundwork for further Ray Harryhausen movies. There would never be one, but there were plans for it. And in fact, the sequel was at least roughed out as a script, and some of the artwork was Harryhausen had sketched out the monsters as well. So they're all set to do a sequel, and it was going to be called Force of the Trojans, and it would have been the story of Aeneas. So the sequel to Clash of the Titans would have been the story of the Aeneid, and there were monster designs for Scylla and Charybdis, for example. And it never came to pass. It was another cancelled project, and Ray Harryhausen himself has said in writing that he thinks it's because by the mid-80s, people wanted gore and they wanted horror and they wanted violence. So it was the era of, I guess, Terminator and Aliens and what else? Hellraiser, I guess. There were new franchises that were a lot more adult, and Clash of the Titans is not an adult movie in that it doesn't have any objectionable content for young viewers, and that was not really marketable. So unfortunately, Force of the Trojans never came to light, and is perhaps to be put together with Ilios' Betrayal of Gods as an attempt to do the Aeneid for popular audiences that didn't work. It doesn't mean there have been none, but there's never been a really famous one. And Homer's ascendancy is unchallenged, whether you regard Troy as a historical story or as a mythological story. And I think it's maybe time for the Aeneid to finally assert its place in the world of video games as they become increasingly diverse. They're often compared with movies, with Hollywood as an economic industry, but also as a kind of audience ecosystem. They're quite similar as well. So you've got the AAA titles, which are the Hollywood, and then you've got the other end, which is the independent games and the experimental games. And yeah, I think it's perhaps time that somebody did the Aeneid and cracked the formula in the way that Homeric games have done in several instances, right up to last year. Okay, so I've done a long kind of overview from the mid 80s and early 80s down to the present day. And the Aeneid has in fact had traction in graphic novels, but that's another story. But I think I'll end my presentation there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dunstan. I've found my way back into the virtual Ure Museum. Oh, I can even take my mask off for a moment, maybe so you can hear me. I certainly have learned a lot from that presentation. We certainly got the gist of what you were saying, as well as many of your, I don't know if I'll say beautiful, but stunning images. Yes.
Well, some of them are.
I'm waiting for urging our virtual audience to add some questions into the Q&A. I hope the virtual audience can see. I think that we've got people in the live audience with me who have some questions. Edward, sitting right next to me, actually has a question, and so maybe if I turn my screen to him, you can even see him.
Maybe. Hello.
Oh, hi. Good to see you. Hello.
For the fascinating talk. It was wonderful. And the first game that came to mind whenever I was listening was Age of Mythology. I don't know if you saw that one or heard of that one, but I played through it a couple times, and they reimagined the characters of all the major, like the Ajax, Perseus, all of them, very relevant to the games, but not so much a regular Troy story per se. Thoughts on that and how it relates to your general themes of your talk?
Yes, that's a really good example. I unfortunately didn't have time to talk about it, but there is a Trojan horse in the Titans expansion. Let me just get it off my shelf. Okay, so this is the game we're talking about. Age of Mythology, which is a strategy game with a mythological theme. Very popular among people of a certain age, and actually I think it had a huge influence on a number of future classicists. And yeah, I'm not sure if you can make this out, but in this edition you have the original version and then the Age of Titans expansion, and in that there is a Trojan horse, but there are a number of mythological characters. It is quite plot heavy. In a way it's like Warriors Legends of Troy, or like Total War Saga Troy, because it's very hero driven, and I think it's inevitable that it is. Maybe those earlier strategy games had lost something by having so few prominent individual characters, because it's really a narrative about individuals. It's not about pitched battles so much. Even the battles themselves are largely duels, where we see them, and we see a lot of where the spears go in and where they come out, and we care about individuals and their lineage and their interactions with one another. So yeah, games like Age of Mythology are showing their depth of research, but also doing interesting creative things with them. So yeah, thanks for raising that example. That's a good one. Absolutely, I recommend it to people.
Anyone else in our live audience got a question? Barbara Goff.
Hello, Dunstan. This is a question from complete ignorance. Thank you very much for that. But how can you have a strategy game if you know the end?
Well, good question. I should point out that although ancient history strategy games have long been popular, and the first one ever was called Hammurabi, and it was just an economic kind of simulation where you had to keep your people happy with grain as an ancient Babylonian king. The vast majority of historical games are not ancient, and in fact the most popular historical period has been World War II, and of course everybody knows what happens there. It's interesting to see how they portray individual skirmishes, because of course you can do whatever you want locally within the narrative, within the chronology, but I think the idea that you could have a different ending is sometimes quite appealing. And in fact, every pitched battle in a portrayal of two armies against each other could go one of two ways, and I think people quite enjoy creating a false history, creating the other ending, and that possibility is always there. It doesn't change the overall narrative. You've still got an overarching end point which can't really be changed, but there are some game genres where that's much more possible. For example, role-playing games, and the type of thing where it's more of a branching narrative. There you really can have multiple endings, and there's a pleasure in that. So yeah, I keep saying that everybody knows how the story of Troy ends, but I'm not saying that there aren't games where you could have an alternative ending. You could have Troy survive and the Greeks fail. I don't know which games do that, but I'm prepared to guess that there are such games, and it doesn't bother people at all. It doesn't change the appeal. It's a lot more about the marketing.
Barbara was just pointing out the an alternative of leaving the horse outside, i.e. not bringing it in. That reminds me of another point that your presentation brought to my consciousness, if I'd thought of this a month or so ago, I would have organized this entire seminar series differently and had you immediately after Amanda Potter, because many times in your presentation, you've talked about the very strong influence of film, maybe to a lesser degree television, on gaming. And I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on, since you didn't talk so much about television, if and why that might have been less influential than film, or, I mean, it's kind of obvious why film was influential because it came before, but television came before gaming too. So,
yeah, no, I think you can trace the influence of TV. I don't have the book in my hand, but I have just laid hands on Ross Clare's very recent monograph, which is about the relationship between video games and other media in the way that portray ancient Greece and Rome are portrayed. And like I said, I haven't read it quite yet. I've got it at home, but I think he's going to talk about TV as well. You can definitely trace the influence of individual films across other media. When I was talking about those kind of metaphors of splash and shadow and so on, they very often have gone from movie to video games in past decades. I don't know whether that's still going on, but I think the reverse is going to be increasingly true, that a game can influence other media. I think Troy on TV does exist, but I don't think it's been quite as high profile. Of course, you can talk more generally about antiquity, about how ancient warriors and ancient cities look, and I'm sure you could find influences there. Yeah, and a long-running series like Xena, for example, when you mentioned Amanda Potter, it reminded me of Hercules and Xena. I'm sure that they had their Trojan horses at least once. But as for influence on video games, I can't think of a concrete example. I'd be very interested to hear of one. So if anybody knows of a place where video games have borrowed from TV as well as from movies and comic books and so on, I'd be very interested. Yeah, as a long rambling reply, basically no, I don't know of any examples.
Two comments in the Q&A.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that I don't, neither of these people are admitting who they are, or technology is not admitting who they are, but one makes a simple point. Yeah, technology progresses, but it could be the same person who said gaming is becoming a much larger industry as technology. There are many games nowadays that incorporate ancient history with heavy mythological aspects and is a useful tool for storytelling. Do you think more games in the next few years will start incorporating stories like these more? That is your prediction that the Aeneid is about to have its day, or are you glancing into your own career as the producer of these things?
No, sadly not. I mean, I'd love to explore that, but yeah, I won't say anything at the moment. I think we can find games which like to take a new perspective on things. Hades was Game of the Year for 2020 for most people, and that's a really interesting take on Greek myth, where you're looking from the point of view of Hades' son Zagreus, who is a marginal figure, best known from the Orphic hymns, but in this version he is made the centre of a narrative of a large dysfunctional Olympian family, and every god, pretty much, or most of the gods, maybe 75%, are all brought in as characters around him, and it's that's a fascinating, a very fresh take, which has, I mean, you've got a very kind of diverse cast of gods and afterlife denizens, and another example immediately sprang to mind when that was mentioned. Let's see, Hades and ancient history with mythological aspects. Oh, it's gone. Anyway, no, but there are lots of examples right now of people doing this. I remember it again. There's a game called The Last Penelope, something like The Last, oh gosh, Penelope, The Last something. It's a futuristic racing game, but in that story, Penelope is the one rescuing or going back home to Odysseus, and it's therefore a game which is analogous to that whole novel and short fiction phenomenon, which is feminist retellings of well-known Greek mythological stories, like the Penelopiad and Lavinia and lots of other examples. Yeah, so I think that now that video games are maturing, and by that I mean kind of being embedded in popular imagination, we're going to see the same things happening there as we are in other media, and that means, yeah, they're not going away. They're absolutely going to keep growing, and yeah, I would like to see a futuristic or steampunk Aeneid, or at least part of the Aeneid in a game. I think it will happen. It's just a matter of when.
The good news is that Anonymous was asking that as we're interested in it as a potential job prospect. So maybe we'll have birthed a new Aeneid. But yeah. This Shira, who's out there in our cyber audience, asks, sorry, I'm late, so this may have been discussed or focused on already, but what are your thoughts on the recent game Immortals Phoenix Rising?
Phoenix Rising, yeah.
They take a very humorous stance to mythology, but also with very interesting social themes.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that at all. Yes, so another game from last year, 2020, Immortals Phoenix Rising. Yeah, very high profile game, sort of an offshoot of the Assassin's Creed franchise. A more kind of family friendly mythological take, highly humorous, lots of meta game jokes. And just to explain for people that don't know the game, the whole thing is about a female ancient Greek who is washed up on an island, which is the Golden Isle, or Isles, and it turns out to be a place where all the Olympian gods have been imprisoned by Typhoeus, who's escaped, and you have to free them to battle him. And the whole thing is framed as a dialogue between Zeus and the chained Prometheus, and they're discussing what happened. So they're telling the story, and they are trying to remember and prompt each other about what happened next, and then you play it. So the whole thing is framed as something that happened in the past, and there are tons and tons of jokes. Absolutely, a lot of them are very kind of well, it's almost like The Simpsons. There will be occasional meta, like frame-breaking jokes, like jokes about how their own story is being told. Yeah, I'm really glad that was mentioned too. I didn't have time to talk about that. I don't know if there's a Trojan horse in that game. I don't think there is. Maybe I can be corrected. But it does have lots of allusions to myths, so I'm sure it's mentioned at least.
Emma Aston, I'm going to go closer to her so you can see her and hear her again.
Great.
Hi, Dunstan.
Hi.
Can hear me all right. I had a question about whether you feel video games on the whole are a bit less prompt than novels and movies set in antiquity to use the ancient world to explore novels and films have often set in antiquity things like same-sex relationships and LGBT themes, and have been a really important way of exploring those. But my impression from the outside is that video games haven't really done that. Is that a mistaken impression, or do you think that's true?
No, overall, you're right, and I think that there's one big exception, which is Hades, and I'm going to mention that again in a moment. And that's very recent and somewhat of an independent game. It was not a major studio that produced it. But I think you're right. There is great controversy over socially progressive portrayals of the past in video games, and in fact, such themes in all games. I'm just going to say the word Gamergate, and I'm not going to touch it because it makes everybody very upset, but it is an interesting thing to research. The game Hades, I said it has a diverse cast of supernatural characters. Zagreus himself, your character, is bisexual. Athena is black, and a couple of other gods are as well, or just various different shades. And let's see, Achilles and Patroclus are reunited as a couple in antiquity, in the afterlife, if you accomplish certain outcomes. And what else? yeah, there are other examples like that, but by and large, it's a very imaginative portrayal of every character, and some of them have been reimagined. Like, for example, Eurydice is. You get the impression that she's got all this foliage which is kind of bunched like that. It looks a bit like an afro, whereas by contrast, Orpheus has very pale skin and a shock of black hair and kind of streaming black makeup around his eyes and a very effete kind of a voice, and he's much more of an emo, and yet they're reunited as a couple. Yeah, it's a really interesting and playful game, and I think it's probably more progressive in those ways than most portrayals of Greek myth in video games. Of course, the games I've talked about from the 80s and 90s are not going to do the same things as games from the 21st century. So there is movement, but I think in the hierarchy of genres of media, it's still kind of down in the children/adolescent area, which is going to be less progressive, mostly. Yeah, that was a long ramble. I hope that's okay.
That's it's because of the nice backlighting that we have in the room.
You've become a silhouette.
I have another question online that I'm publishing.
Great.
The rest of the crowd here thinks about it. This is another. It's from Charlotte. Do you think there's a reason why the few games that do allow a central character, for example, Hades and Ilios, focus on a minor figure from mythology rather than a main mythological figure like Achilles?
Well, good question. It may be this instinct to make a story fresh by retelling it from a different point of view. And I've already mentioned Ursula Le Guin's novel Lavinia, which tells the story of Aeneas from the point of view of Lavinia, who barely gets a word in the Aeneid, or the Penelopiad, which is Penelope Atwood's retelling of, Margaret Atwood's retelling of the story of Odysseus from the point of view of, I believe, Penelope and a chorus of hanged maidens near the end of the Odyssey. So yeah, when you take a character who dies or is unable to say much in the customary version, then when you tell their story, then you automatically make it fresh. There might be something political about that. It might be a progressive instinct to kind of give voice to those who have been subalterns, or it might just be a creative, a long-standing creative tradition that you take a new perspective. It's what Virgil does. His Trojan fan fiction takes Aeneas, a somewhat minor character in Homer, and makes him the star, and then tells all these new stories about him. Yeah, so I think it's organic. I think that's how stories branch off and keep growing. But yeah, the nature of the retelling, that's interesting to examine. I hadn't thought about it that way, so thank you. It's a good question.
And it reminds me also of going back to film, back when the film Gladiator used the time of Commodus, because the history wasn't strong enough to sort of refute what they were going to say in the film.
Yeah, maybe you have more freedom, especially when you're looking at a historical setting. If you have a lesser known character, exactly. If you're trying to tell the story of Julius Caesar, then you're hedged in.
Local audience to shame. I've just published a new question from another anonymous, perhaps the same one. There seems to be a unique style to the look of these games, as well as the obvious examples of the horse. Are you going to look more at the concept of games having a different setting, i.e. futuristic, dystopian, techno, and still having the story of the Trojan War in a non-Greek looking setting? Do you think that it will have an impact on the cultural themes of the story that the people are already familiar with?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I haven't given that much thought, but it's interesting to consider how many. I mean, I mentioned that the game in which you play as Penelope flying a spaceship, and then of course there's the French cartoon Ulysses 31, French-Japanese production, which I think has been really influential, where Ulysses is the captain of a starship trying to cross the galaxy. Yeah, I think yeah, these kind of fantasy and crossover settings is another way to refresh the story. But yeah, I can't be sure, just thinking off the top of my head, what it is that's essential about the original that comes across. I mean, there's the names, and I'm always a bit skeptical about things that only have names. Like, for example, Trojan. That game has Trojan and Achilles. Take out those names, there's nothing recognizable. But if you have something else, something thematic to grasp at, that can be ported into any other story world, and that's yeah, those kind of, the more tangible it is, the better, from my point of view. I'm really interested in how large chunks of the original are ported into a new setting. If it's just a shallow comparison, then to me that's less interesting. But it's the deeper ones, the deeper engagements that make you think. Like, for example, Hades. It tells you a bunch of stories that you know well, but it tells them from another point of view. It turns them inside out. Yeah, so I'm rambling again, but again, I'm provoked into thinking on my feet by these interesting questions. Yeah, I'd like to hear other people's thoughts on it, actually.
Well, another thought on that comes from Teixeira, who points out there's also Pat Barker's Silence of the Girls, which is from the point of view of Theus, which is also really interesting and really delves into the various perspectives of the slave woman, both in her role as slave and as woman, obviously. So that's a very good point, and I think this is something that obviously the gaming shares again with television and filmic interpretations, that they, even if they just take the name, still they make you think about them in different ways. Do we have any further questions from our live audience? Nicholas does. Just a moment. I think I'm going to go over to him if that's okay.
Great.
Hi. Why do you think the Aeneid has failed so far in film and games? Is it just the wrong time, like with the sequel to Clash of the Titans, or is it something to do with subject matter or the content of the Aeneid?
Yes, I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit by saying it's cursed. I'm sure there are Aeneid, TV MIDI series out there to be found. I think it's really the dominance of Homer in video games that's. I mean, it's hard to beat. If people know anything about Troy and related things, in particular Greek myth, then they wouldn't realise that much of what we know about it or believe about it is from Ovid's retelling in the Metamorphoses, and some of it's from Virgil, or even from later mythographers. They will see the core, the most canonical stuff as they see it, as located at the beginning with Homer. I think it's really interesting that Homer's pieces of the map, as it were, of the Trojan myth are quite small and funny shaped. A lot more of it came in the Trojan cycle, the later epics, which are mostly lost, but influenced Virgil and Ovid. Sorry, could you just remind me of your question? I think I went right off the target.
I was just asking why you thought it had failed, whether it was the wrong time, wrong place, or something else.
Yeah, I think that's it. People don't really know Virgil, and if they do, then they think of Virgil in Dante. There's a very good game, or a very interesting game, Dante's Inferno, from a couple of years back. So Dante's have been inspiring games. Yeah, so why not Virgil's Aeneid? I don't know what was going on there. Most likely it's got too much overlap with Homer. But.
Speaking from the perspective of someone who teaches myth and art, of course, there's no shortage of things that people think we know about because of the Greeks, and they really know about it from Ovid or later mythographers in the Renaissance. We don't seem to have any more questions online, but we've got another one here in our live audience.
Hi there.
Hello.
I'm sort of wondering about what your take is on likes of Assassin's Creed. They have introduced their historical route for it. Obviously, it the Odyssey pretty much avoided Troy, apart from a small scene with the Trojan horse on a beach.
Yeah, which is really just a joke. I mean, it's not. The whole thing is set in the 5th century BC. It's not the real Trojan horse, but it's a horse with warriors that come out of it. Yeah, very strange.
Through their work.
Yeah, so let's see. Sorry, so just say the last bit again. I started talking over you, I think.
Do you find it encouraging that they're including that historical, that they're doing historical tours in their work, encouraging in that way, even if they're not directly trying to, even if they are avoiding Troy itself?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, the Discovery Tour feature of the last 2 Assassin's Creed games is finally the potential of games for education is being realized, and they provide online materials for teachers to use. They're really marketing it as an educational product in that regard. So that was in, oh hang on, I said 2, didn't I? It's the last 3 because Valhalla has that too now. So yeah, I think Assassin's Creed as a franchise is one of the most vivid portrayals of historical pasts, but we've got to remember that the whole thing is framed with a very fantastical storyline that is all from the point of view of the present day, a form of time travel, basically delving into memories. It's all science fiction, and the Atlanteans and the gods were all advanced early humans, and many objects in myth, golden apples, whatever else, I guess Excalibur and whatever else, is all advanced pieces of technology. Yeah, it's a really weird mixture of an attempt to be really vividly well researched and yet an engrossing fantasy. And the trouble with games that look realistic is that they trick you into thinking that they are authentic, and of course they can never be. And the things that they make most vivid are sometimes more vivid because they are less authentic, they are less nuanced and less complicated. So there is nothing unknown in the portrayal of an ancient building when you're exploring it. If you see it in a diagram, or you read about it being described, or you see it in the field, then things are less certain. But just as even a single building must be filled out with imagination, vast historical narratives and settings are treated exactly the same way. Yeah, I think it's a deeply interesting franchise, and it is rightly being documented very thoroughly in scholarship, probably as I'm speaking. There have been chapters published on it by classical scholars, and there will be lots more as well. So yeah, really important. Yeah, it was an excuse to mention it, that there is kind of a Trojan horse in one of the games, but it is an extremely important franchise for historical gaming. So yeah, thanks for bringing that in too.
I've got a question following on that, actually.
Yes.
Or made me think about it. You say that it's sort of a new development that they're beginning to use gaming more for educational reasons. Has there been a discernible change, or is it too early to see since COVID and lockdowns?
Interesting. No, I haven't been able to study that, but I think only sociologists have been studying the effects of the pandemic. But maybe in a couple of years' time, we'll be able to see material changes. All I know is that certain games became really popular, and I think Animal Crossing New Horizons has got a couple of art objects in it which are inspired by the Discobolus and a couple of other famous ancient sculptures. So, I mean, there's a little bit of stuff like that in some games, but I don't know of any apart from Hades that could really have claimed to be a pandemic era game that's really closely engaging with classical antiquity. And that's just a good game anyway. It would have been fine. But if it could be tied to people's educational habits, that would be that'd be surprising and interesting.
Well, maybe I'll get a few new sculpture students in a few years as a result of that.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. Good question. This may be off topic, but you and I go off topic too, so that's okay. What are your thoughts on the recent developments on exploring ancient sites through virtual reality? I think definitely a related topic.
Absolutely. Oh, I love it. I think it's really important. There have been a couple of games, not big ones, but kind of proof of concept games which show archaeology themed activities from the point of view of Oculus Rift or some other immersive technology. Yeah, I think that is one of the futures that is yet to materialize fully. I taught this class. I mentioned that I taught a module at Kent last year called Ancient Worlds in Digital Gaming, and one of the topics I talked about at the end of the year was games that use that technology, and there's a few. None of them like massively successful, and some of them are mythological. A couple of them are gladiator themed. Yeah, but I think it will be. Yeah, I don't think it's a gimmick that's going to die away. I think it's really important. It's going to keep becoming more important for all themes in games, including classical antiquity. I don't know about Troy. I don't think there's any Troy ones, but there will be, I'm sure.
I think we've come to an almost perfectly natural conclusion to this event, actually. So it's my delight once again to thank you, Dunstan, for coming and joining us virtually. It feels like you're in the same room as us, except you have the benefit of being in a room with lots and lots of books and games that relate to just what you're talking about. Yet,
yeah, I wish I had more.
I'm an expert you are. I'm delighted to see that. I think that's one of your Oxford classical dictionaries. It's just in the foreground, just ahead of you, up there.
Yeah. Artfully, all of this is virtual back here. It's just an immersive virtual reality. It's not really this messy at all.
It's also making me jealous because it looks like you've got more space than we have in our offices here in Reading. But anyway, that just might be optics. Anyway,
fisheye
again, and to convince you that we have a live audience here, I'm going to invite everyone else to clap along with me.
Thank you.
And when your colleagues and students and children give you the opportunity to, please come visit us as soon as you can.
I would love to. Thank you.